This splash art took me roughly 163 hours to finish over the span of 5 weeks. And of those hours, 25 of them were spent on ideating and sketching poses for thumbnails. But here's the thing, that small chunk of time decides almost everything, from the story to the direction and the emotion of your piece. A splash without a convincing pose is like a Subway sandwich without the bread. You can pile on all the toppings you'd like and it still wouldn't be considered much of a sandwich. So then what makes a good pose? Is it the anatomy? Well, not alone. You can have perfect anatomy while your pose still looks stiff as a rock. Okay, so then it's gesture. Well, maybe, but if the acting's off, it can still feel incongruent. What about expressions then? Expressions are important, but without structure and gesture, it will look amateur. The real answer is that it's the combination. A dynamic gesture paired with the right amount of acting and structure working together in harmony, like a sandwich mixed with the perfect flavor combo. That combo is a puzzle, and today I'll show you how I go about solving it, starting all the way from the beginning, from where we start sketching a pose and how I ideate poses quickly, to my general process and best tips on how to make your characters feel more alive. So let's get into it. When I think back to my earliest attempts at sketching poses for thumbnails, I remember barely being able to keep my figures structurally accurate, much less worry about the more advanced things. And I'd also often cling to my first ever sketch rather than exploring my options because at the time, even a single pose was already a big investment for me. And so in order to focus on the more nuanced things that will improve our poses beyond the basics, we need to talk about two things first: observation and fundamentals. And I know to some people, fundamentals sounds a little obvious, but let me elaborate. I think it goes a little deeper than what meets the eye. So firstly, fundamentals free up our attention. And what I mean by that is, while drawing, attention is a limited resource, kind of like RAM. And early on, the basics eat up nearly all of it. Like, it takes a significant amount of effort just to avoid common mistakes in anatomy, proportions, or perspective. So the aim then is to train our fundamentals until they're closer to a second nature. And once they're more automatic, they cost less RAM, which you can then invest all of that extra attention into the juicier things like acting, gesture, or expression. Like, it's hard to think about flavor combos or presentation when you're still struggling with the basics like prepping the ingredients or baking the bread. Not to mention, developing stronger fundamentals also makes it easier to explore poses, since a single pose no longer feels like a huge investment. But on the topic of fundamentals, I'd like to give a quick shout out to the sponsor of today's video, ArtWad. ArtWad is an online drawing program with learning paths designed for artists of all levels. If you've ever struggled with the uncertainty of not knowing what specifically to work on as a self-taught artist, ArtWad not only helps guide you in the right direction by breaking down complex subjects into digestible bite-sized lessons, but their progress tracking and little gamified elements also help keep you consistent, which is already half the battle. They cover many topics, starting from the absolute basics all the way to more advanced concepts. And I've personally gotten the chance to try out their Intro to Anatomy and Architecture Basics roadmaps. I found them quite easy to follow because their lessons have clear progression systems that build on the knowledge you learn. As someone who's always struggled with designing background elements, their architecture roadmap showed me all the ways you can manipulate the designs of buildings, which was super interesting to me. But in the context of this video, they also have roadmaps covering figures and the human body if you ever feel the need to brush up on your anatomy. It's kind of like Duolingo except for art. So if that's something you're interested in, make sure to use the discounted link below to grab a 30% off ArtWad's premium plans before the offer expires. And now, back to the video. Next is observation. I think that beyond sheer mileage, pros are able to sketch convincing poses efficiently because they've developed the habit of observation. When most of us look at a reference or illustration, we tend to make a simple judgment of whether it's good or bad, and then continue scrolling without taking the time to ask ourselves what it is specifically that's working or not working. But just by virtue of digging a little deeper, it turns images into memory, which eventually builds a library of solutions we can call upon when a similar situation arises. On the other hand, if we don't observe, we simply forget because our brain only keeps what seems relevant. Like, you probably don't remember what you ate for breakfast, specifically 4 days ago. So an exercise you can try the next time you see an image you like or dislike is to try to point out these two things. What makes this image so appealing or unappealing? And then what did they do to achieve that effect? Or what do you think they could have done differently? For example, this is one of my favorite splash arts of all time. But what makes this image so appealing? What draws me into this piece is that feeling of awe when you're witnessing one of these slow motion scenes that can only be captured with a high shutter speed camera, like time is slowing down in a chaotic moment.
Hey guys, you should see this.
And immediately what catches my eye in this moment is the dynamic pose. But it can't be just the pose, because if we take away the environment, it suddenly loses a lot of its initial impact. So then how did he create such a feeling of momentum going into this movement? And also, how's this environment contributing to the motion? To me, it seems like the particle effects play a huge role. Besides just using the particle effects to imply the material's toughness by contrasting the types of friction, for example, the water flows, the glass shatters, and the metal creates sparks, the particle effects also imply the direction the pose is moving in, which not only amplifies the perceived speed of the character, but also the sheer amount of visual noise created from these particle effects illustrate how chaotic this chase scene is, which makes this entire illustration feel so much more immersive. On top of all that, he chooses to keep the particle effects sharp rather than motion blurred because it adds to that slow motion feeling. Okay, maybe we're getting a little off topic with this tangent, but I hope you can see how the next time I'm working on a scene with a lot of chaos and movement, I can apply these very same principles I've just observed. And the same can be done with observing poses to a deeper level, whether it's the subtle shifts in demeanor, posture, or expression. All this to say, developing the habit of observation has helped me remember to reference specific solution and pose ideas I've come across in the past instead of trying to reinvent the wheel every time, which in turn has also helped my process become more and more efficient. So it's an amazing way to gain secondhand experience without even drawing. So TLDR, here's what we've discussed so far. Strengthening our fundamentals leaves room for us to focus on the more advanced concepts that will further improve our poses beyond the basics. And by building the habit of observation, we're also building a library of solutions we can later apply to make sketching poses faster.
I'm in a hurry. I've got a very important phone call to make.
Now, I know you're probably in a hurry and eager to get some actual tips on sketching poses, but unfortunately this topic is too important to ignore. So let's go over this again, briefly. I used to assume that pros could picture not only the pose, but the entire painting in their head before they even touched the canvas. But that couldn't be further from the truth. Unless you're the goat. It's normal to have a rough idea, but thumbnails are an iterative process, and it's hard to iterate if you start with nothing. But where do we look for references, and which ones are the most helpful when it comes to sketching poses specifically? Just as an example, here are the references I used early on while sketching poses for this splash art. Besides having some images of your character, which is the bare minimum, the most useful references at this stage are the ones that embody the character's personality, those that give you instant ideas for postures, gestures, or expressions. And these references have helped me a lot because it allows me to spark an idea just by using little elements from these references as potential starting points to my sketch. Whether it's the tilt of the head, the shoulder attitude, or different hand poses. And once we have a starting point, we can then mix and match like you're a pose scientist. More on that later. And a lot of people have asked me where I find my references, but I really don't use any special underground websites or anything like that. I mainly use Pinterest to find my reference images, just because they have a lot of high quality photos, and their search engine makes it really easy to find similar images. But I also browse Twitter and ArtStation pretty often, and if I'm ever lacking inspiration, I also have a library of just saved artwork that I can just scroll back on those websites. As for referencing software, I've always been using PureF, and I'll always highly recommend it to any artist that does digital art, not only because it's free, but because it's a software built for artists. So it has many useful features, like you can drag and drop images, use text, flip the images however you want, and turn them into grayscale whenever. So if you don't already use it, I highly recommend you check it out. Okay, now with references out of the way, we can finally start talking about. So far, we've prepped the ingredients with our fundamentals and references. Now we actually need to make the sandwich. But where's the best place to start sketching the pose? Is it the face, the arms, or sketching out the torso? While there isn't a universally correct way, I found being more flexible helps, since there are so many different pose scenarios. For example, sometimes, like we mentioned earlier, it might be a good idea to start with a specific point based on your reference. But other times, you might have a rough idea of your pose but not the exact reference on hand, in which case there's a simple 3-step process to help construct a foundation to build any pose off of. First, let's start by breaking down the human body into 3 core building blocks: the head, ribcage, and pelvis. The hardest part about taking a pose idea and drawing it in a specific angle is figuring out how each section of the body relates to each other in 3D space. For example, when I was sketching LeBlanc, I knew I wanted roughly this pose except facing the camera. So by starting with these 3 components, we can block out the general direction of the core building blocks of the body. Try to be specific when you're thinking about which direction you want the components to be facing. Turning the components so they face opposing directions horizontally would create a twist, and the same vertically would create a bend or a stretch. And the bigger the difference, the more exaggerated the movement will feel. Usually if it's an action pose, it will call for more exaggeration, like swinging a sword or running. But do keep in mind, however, there are anatomical restrictions, so don't go too crazy. Typically, I like to start with the head and then establish its relationship with the ribcage and then pelvis. And don't forget to add the center line. And here's one final tip. Since this is still early on in sketching the pose and still the thumbnail stage, you're not really obligated to follow through on any one pose idea. So don't be afraid to experiment a little, try different twisting and turning motions between these 3 components, and who knows, you'll maybe end up with a base that's more interesting than your initial idea. All you're drawing is boxes after all. It's not a huge commitment. Step 2 is adding the limbs. Now, seeing that the limbs can extend in many different directions, it may feel a little daunting, but it's also quite simple if we start with the intent of the pose, like, is she casting a spell, or is she slashing a sword? Then, find references and try to iterate based off of them. And then beyond that, we can also consider more advanced things, like gesture or foreshortening. For example, for gesture, we can also use the limbs to create an alternative line of action that intersects the main gesture, which will draw attention to the center, making an easy focal point. And for foreshortening, we can have one limb forward and one limb back to have more overlapping forms and to emphasize proximity, making it feel more dynamic. But these are just a couple of examples of techniques we can get creative with when we're adding the limbs. And like I mentioned earlier, it's important to experiment. Be a pose scientist. While the investment is low, committing too soon has an opportunity cost. And don't be afraid to mix and match. For example, you might like the hand pose for the current sketch, but the torso from a different sketch. And so you can try combining these poses in different ways. This is not only an efficient way to explore using the assets you've already drawn, but I also just find it fun trying different things. If you think about it, it's kind of like making a Subway sandwich, isn't it? There are just so many combos for you to try, and it's not like you're gonna come up with the perfect combo on your first try. And on top of that, if you're ever afraid of losing your initial idea after changing the pose, you can always duplicate the layer to save that progress as a checkpoint in case things don't work out. So you really have nothing to lose and so much to gain through experimentation. Even while sketching LeBlanc, I had so much fun trying unconventional poses from different angles. Anyways, now that we have our basic pose, the third and final step is to clean up your line art. And this just means to add all the designs, costumes, and weapons, and then clean up your line art. After the first sketch, I lower the opacity of the layer before starting the next pass. And I usually like to do this in 1 to 2 passes. But how do you know when your line art is clean enough to move on? Well, you don't actually have to make your line art picture perfect, since you will be painting over the lines later anyways, but as long as the lines are readable and the forms are clear enough, it should be fine. Whenever I start sketching, I'm usually using a bigger brush because it allows for more flexibility. Thicker lines can act as a placeholder. More room for you to experiment as you clean up your sketch, rather than feeling like you're stuck with whatever you had on your first pass. And then later on, we can start using a smaller brush to narrow down the specifics of the line art. Eventually, we should end up with a reasonably clean sketch ready for us to block in the values and lighting for the thumbnails. So then that's it, right? We've prepared the ingredients and assembled the sandwich. Except, why does it still feel like we're missing something? A pose without good acting is like a sandwich without sauce. Even if it's structurally accurate, it's bland. And the point of a splash art isn't only to make everything look rendered and polished. The soul of an illustration lies in the fantasy it creates. The fantasy that helps us immerse ourselves in this character's reality. And good acting in a pose can make or break that feeling of immersion. Most of the time, acting can be a pretty intuitive process. Like, it doesn't require a genius to know what aggressive, happy, or sad acting might look like. But the part I think most people miss is the subtlety. For example, if someone's chin is raised or lowered, it can tell us if they are prideful and confident, or maybe meek and timid. And if we tilt the head slightly paired with the right expression, it might add a tinge of arrogance. Or a relaxed expression might feel more graceful. The interesting thing with acting is that the slightest adjustment can change the entire feeling of the character. And this subtlety can extend to any area, not just the head and expression, although those are the main ones. Let's take a simple fist, for example. Sure, we can draw it in the most basic way possible and it would still work, but a fist can express many things. A fist more clenched, where all the fingers are packed so tightly that they point inwards, can show aggression, anxiety, or resolve. Or if we want to show this character is nervous, we can have a thumb under the fingers, as if the outer fingers are protecting the thumb, like some sort of subconscious self-soothing behavior. A thumb inside the fist can also mean they're inexperienced with fighting, because if you throw a punch like that, you're going to break your own thumb. We can also try protruding one of the knuckles or fingers more to create that aggressive triangle shape, while also creating variation and shape appeal. There are so many possibilities with subtle changes in hand poses, postures, and expressions, and a single one can add so much flavor to your pose, like a cherry on top. Or in this case, a sandwich with the perfect sauce. But even though we know that subtleties are important, how do we go about recognizing them in the first place? Starting to identify these things is the first step, which ties into the first point we made in the video. Learning to observe is your biggest asset. Your ability and taste as an artist relies on you to understand what you're seeing beyond the obvious. If we're able to pick up on these subtle shifts in mannerisms, it will help us better identify references that aid us during our sketching phase, which will further improve the quality of the acting in our poses. So, as you can hopefully see, everything we've discussed today worked together harmoniously, like making the perfect sandwich with properly prepped ingredients, great toppings, and an absolutely impeccable sauce. And with our newfound knowledge of drawing poses, we can use it to move on to the next stage of thumbnailing, which is blocking in your values, colors, and lighting, which we will talk about in the next video, which hopefully I'll be able to finish before the end of the year. But in the meantime, if you happen to be in Toronto, I will be boothing at the Toronto Gaming Expo at November 22nd to 23rd at this table in the Artist Alley. So if you're in the area, feel free to come by and say hello. I'm always happy to make new friends. But yeah, I hope these tips gave you more insights, and more importantly, I hope this video gets you excited to try new things the next time you go about sketching poses. In fact, you should close this video right now and start sketching poses. All I'm saying.